In this video, we're going to talk about 3 different shutter drag techniques. And at the end, I have some homework for you because I'd love to feature some of you inside of my Instagram stories. I'm going to talk about using constant lights and strobes. We are going to use a light meter to show you how, and then I'm going to teach you 3 shutter drag effects to get images like this zoom shutter drag, linear shutter drag, and this subject motion blur. This was all done with 2 lights, one Profoto D2 strobe and a Nanlite Forza 500 LED constant light. The metering techniques in this video will apply to any light meter that has a mode for measuring flash and a mode for measuring constant lights or ambient light. The creative direction for this shoot was a portrait of a denim designer, not only wearing denim, but also having some of the denim they design hung around the set. Now let's jump right in and talk about our main light. I have a 3-foot octa feathered away from our subject and tilted up. Here you can see what the light looks like on our model as I feathered the light back and forth. I wanted her to catch just the edge of the light. I feathered it so we didn't get as much spill on the background and tilted it up so the model's face was brighter than her knee, and the light falls off dramatically by the time it gets to the floor. This will cause a lot of light to bounce around the set, but I like that it gives me a subtle fill over the entire set as well. I set my meter into cordless flash mode, so the meter will sense when a flash is fired and give me an aperture reading. So I set my ISO to 100, then I set my shutter speed to 1/4 of a second. Then I turn off my modeling light so that it does not affect my exposure because my shutter speed is going to be so low. Next, while in cordless mode, I press the measure button on the light meter so that it waits for a flash to fire, and then I trigger the flash using a trigger in my other hand to get approximately f8. Using cordless mode is how you meter flash if you don't have a meter with a compatible trigger. I'll measure at the model's forehead and at her knee to make sure the light is brighter towards the model's head and falling off as expected. I'm metering with the light dome down, so I am only measuring the light hitting our model on her right-hand side. If I was using a Sekonic L308X, I would recommend getting the flat disc accessory, which is like metering with the light dome down. Now that I've measured my strobe, I want to measure my constant lights. So first, I am going to put the meter into ambient light mode. I'm choosing the ambient mode with the T next to it, indicating shutter priority. Now when I press the measure button, the meter is not going to look for a flash, but it will simply measure as soon as I press the button. So keeping my shutter speed at 1/4 of a second and my ISO at 1/100th, I measure my constant light, and using the Nanlite wireless app, I adjust the power on my constant light until I get an aperture of f8. To do this, I constantly hold the measure button down while adjusting the power on the Nanlite. Now that my 2 lights are balanced, I also flag the model's face and part of the background using a Cupo black flag to protect some areas from motion blur, because the flash is going to instantaneously expose the parts that it is hitting, and the constant light is going to continuously expose the parts of the image that it is hitting as long as the shutter is open, giving us the shutter drag. So in this image using zoom drag, we see a greater amount of drag where the constant light is hitting. So now that we understand how we meter this shot, let's talk about 3 different ways to get motion blur in your images. The first is zoom blur, because we're going to zoom the lens during the exposure. So making sure the modeling light is off on the strobe, I hit the shutter, then immediately zoom the lens while the shutter is still open. I recommend using a zoom lens that has a fixed aperture throughout so you don't have to worry about your exposure changing. But try this with whatever lens you have, as the only rule here is to zoom. This technique works both handheld, but a tripod may make it easier to coordinate hitting the shutter button and zooming at the same time. It can help to keep your subject centered, and remember to flag any areas such as the subject's face from the constant light to prevent any blur from those areas. The zoom blur is great when you want the effect of energy emanating from a subject. It gives this forward and backward motion, almost like they're going into a portal. I also recommend only zooming between 20 to 50 millimeters. Sometimes a broad range can water down this effect. Next is a panning blur. For this effect, you simply want to pan your camera in one direction after pressing the shutter, either going left or right. You can do this effect handheld or with a tripod if you want a more straight blur effect. I find using a 24 to 50 millimeter lens makes this technique pretty easy to manage. You see here that the areas of your image that are more reflective, such as the model's skin or the gold jewelry, will be the most noticeable when you drag your shutter. It's also helpful to keep these areas against a dark background when you're starting out. In terms of backgrounds, in this video, I'm using a gravity medium texture backdrop directly behind our model and a blue low texture backdrop to the left of our model. I found that it goes really good with denim. Now for our next blur technique, let's talk about simply capturing the movement. For this technique, it's best to keep your camera still using a tripod and to have your model stay moving, but only to move the things that you want to have a blur. So here I have her moving a stack of hangers in her hand and swinging her leg. In the resulting photo, you can see the effect that it gives. The hangers have motion and her legs blurred out, meaning it's moving as well. This is a great technique if you want to capture the motion of your subject, such as a dancer or an athlete. So now that I've explained these three options, let me give you some quick tips. Tip number 1, to get more or less blur, change your shutter speed. I like to start at 1/4 of a second, and usually I never find myself going faster than 1/15 of a second or beyond 1 second. The beauty of using a light meter is if you want to change your shutter speed, you will also need to adjust the power of your constant light. So for this shot, if I want to go to 1/15 of a second and still be at f8, I would remeter the light and turn the power up until I got f8. This is one of those instances a meter is arguably the best way to save time. It eliminates having to guess. On strobes, it's easy to dial in a stop of light, but on constant lights, you'll be using percentages. And the meter eliminates the guesswork. But depending on how a manufacturer designs their light, usually having or doubling the light will be a one-stop difference, but it's not always the case. Tip number 2, show your subject the result. It can help them better understand how to move and pose to get the effect you are looking for. It also illustrates to them how the section of the image being hit with the constant light is going to be in motion, while the other will remain still. Now for tip number 3, be mindful of mixing color temperatures. Here, I intentionally wanted my constant light to be warmer than my strobe. Strobes will always be in the 5500 to 6500 Kelvin range unless you're in a speed mode, while your constant light range can range from 1500 to 10,000 Kelvin. Know what you want your desired effect to be prior to shooting. And bi-color lights like the Nanlite Forza 500 are great because they give you a range of color temperatures. So, we've learned 3 different ways in which you can do shutter drags. A, you can zoom your lens. B, you can move your camera. And C, you can have just your subject move, having your lens and camera locked down. But what happens if you start to combine 3 of these techniques, or maybe just 2 of them, or maybe you found one that really works with your style? I would love to see you set up a shoot in which you demonstrate one or many of these different techniques, and I want to feature your images on my Instagram stories. All you have to do is DM me with your images. I'd love if you could also include a behind the scenes shot of your lighting setup, feature you on my story, help you get followers, and just build some more community. As you know, there's levels to this. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to see more content just like this on AdoramaTV.